So ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, welcome to Region Media's Voice Referendum debate, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this place, the Ngunnawal people, their elders past, present and emerging. As voting day approaches fast, we've gathered together a bunch of people, none of whom are current politicians, but all of whom are really passionate about their cause. Because what we want out of this debate is some energetic but respectful conversation, the kind of conversation you'd have over an important issue around the kitchen table, having a beer with some mates, the kind of conversation that we should all be having about something as important as the voice referendum. So joining me are, from my left, Ramon Bucart, who's a systems engineer, likely Legislative Assembly candidate. Next to him, Kate Carnell, former ACT Chief Minister, who's leading the National Liberals for Yes campaign. Bill Stefaniak, who's also a very familiar local figure, local campaign leader for the No campaign and founder of the Belko Party. And on the end, Auntie Violet Sheridan, senior Ngunnawal traditional owner. So welcome to you all, and I'm going to start with a really brief statement from each of you as to why you're voting yes or no. Auntie Violet, let me start with you.
I'm voting yes. I'm supporting the yes vote. Is that I believe that we have and hadn't had a voice since the abolishment of ATSEC. And since Howard abolished ATSEC, I was a councillor on ATSEC. I was on there for just almost on 12 months, and where Howard come out and abolished it, and we haven't had a voice since then. And those people that have been there speaking on our behalf haven't been elected there by our local community people. So I believe that the voice to Parliament, us including in us in the Constitution, will give us a voice and speaking on our behalf, because everybody will be elected by local people.
Bill Stefaniak, why are you voting no?
I'm voting no because whilst I think we've made some significant advances since 1967, they're not enough. I can't see the voice doing anything for Indigenous people. I think at best it's going to create another layer of bureaucracy. I think actually, unfortunately, the way it's been put forward is divisive, and I think actually in a way, because of permanently ensconcing in the Constitution the way it is doing it, it actually is detrimental to our Indigenous brothers and sisters, because it impliedly makes them almost a permanent underclass, as if they're always going to be disadvantaged, which I think is nonsense. I remember in 1972 when I was with Amnesty International and the Tent Embassy was established, thinking it's going to take us a while, but in 50 years' time it'll be a very different Australia and there won't be any disadvantage or anything like that. Unfortunately, that is not the situation today. We have made steps. I don't think this really does improve the situation, and what I hope to see out of this whole campaign is a real effort by all Australians and by all Australian governments to engage with Aboriginal people and move forward, and just have a look at the various number of agencies who are supposedly doing a good job for Aboriginal people but aren't.
Kate Carnell, you've really put your hand up as a national leader of Liberals for Yes. Why is the yes vote for you?
Well, I'm going to vote yes because what we've done so far hasn't worked. Now, Bill made that comment, but I think that means you've got to start doing things differently. I know from my experience in politics and in various other things that good policy comes when you talk to the people who are going to be affected by that policy early on, and then you include them in the process of putting that policy in place. And that's what the voice actually does. But for me, the important thing is where the voice came from is from Indigenous leaders themselves, from the Uluru Statement of the Heart. Now, the Uluru Statement of the Heart in 2017 was signed by 250 Indigenous leaders, and they said they wanted recognition. Well, that just goes without saying. I think all sides accept that we've got to recognise Indigenous Australians as Australia's first people, because they were. It's quite simple. The voice is the contentious thing, but the voice is what those 250 Indigenous leaders said they wanted, and as Noel Pearson said and has said often, and they are willing to take responsibility for making it work. And that's the reason I'm going to vote yes. We've got to make changes. We can't continue to spend good money and throw it down the gurgler and not make a difference. Making a difference means listening to Indigenous people and them and they taking responsibility for outcomes.
Ramon, to you, why no?
Yeah, my reason for voting no is really quite simple. I believe in a modern, multicultural Australia, we shouldn't be drawing a distinction between types of Australian citizens on the basis of their ancestry or their race. I think the Voice, while a very well-intentioned proposal, it violates this fundamental principle and seeks to divide us as Australians. I think there are better pathways forward for reconciliation that don't involve enshrining this voice permanently in our Constitution.
And I want to start our conversation on this question of division. And Kate Carnell, I'm going to you first. A fundamental question here is whether the Voice would divide and unfairly privilege or single out some Australians in a nation where equality is one of our deepest, most profound shared values. So how do you respond to that suggestion of division?
Look, I don't think it divides at all. In fact, it does the opposite. If anybody hasn't read the Uluru Statement of the Heart, you should, because that isn't about division. It's about, to quote, walking forward together as a nation. Those are the people who recommended the Voice was a way to do this. So Indigenous Australians are Australia's first people, here for 65,000 years, all of those things. By recognising them and giving them a voice doesn't divide. In fact, it does quite the opposite. It brings us together and gives us a basis for that recognition. Just saying, oh, we recognise them and they're not doing anything is just doesn't have any guts, doesn't have any oomph. If you're going to recognise, you've got to have a method of recognition. And that's what the Voice does.
Bill, I'm going to go to you next on this. Many First Nations people would say they grew up in a bitterly divided society, that there's still a distinct division in their lives and outcomes with almost all other Australians. So how does creating an advisory body without any binding powers disadvantage or divide non-Indigenous Australians? How does that work?
Well, that's assuming you're going to create another body. As I said, I think what you need to do is look at the bodies we have. We already have a body, the National Indigenous Aboriginal Association, the NIAA, which has exactly the same role as the Voice. It's very well funded, and I think at best it's probably done a patchy job. I think what you need is recognition, yes, and you can do that very simply in the Constitution by having a preamble saying Australia is a country with a rich Indigenous history going back 65,000 years or more, British institutions and a vibrant multicultural society. That absolutely describes all of us as Australians. It gives recognition and rightful recognition to the original inhabitants of the country. You don't need to put it in the Constitution. As Ramon said, effectively that in itself is divisive. You are creating another class of Australians with constitutional rights. We are all one. The Australian National Anthem Advance Australia Fair took out young and free and put in one and free. And clearly not all Indigenous people want a voice. They want something different. You've got two very good speakers there in terms of Jacinta Price, who's an exceptional senator for the Northern Territory, and Warren Bundeen, who are clearly dead set against the Voice. And I don't think it is unanimous by any stretch that Indigenous people want this type of voice.
Okay, Aunty Viola, I'm going to go to you because there's no doubt that Aboriginal people continue to suffer significantly worse life outcomes than other Australians. But the question is, what would actually be fixed by this body that other legislated bodies, ATSIC and the like, couldn't do? The Closing the Gap process has notably failed. You haven't got in the Voice any certainty that the funding would be better or any certainty that the administration would be better. So why is this going to work?
I believe that the Voice will work, that it will be elected by all those people that will sit at the table to advise the government are all local people that see what's happening in their communities 24/7, 52 times of the year. Because for too long, people have been handpicked by governments. Having this voice in the referendum, including us in the referendum, will say to the governments that's coming in future that they can't change things on us all the time. This is what's happening, that when ATSEC wasn't the answer pants, but it did some good things, ATSEC. And it was local people sitting at local levels that was elected there by the local people. But I believe the voice will make a difference. Like I said, and I probably people get sick of me, I'm 68-year-old. My eldest granddaughter is 27. She just had her first baby. This gap is still not closed. Something has to be different, and I believe this voice will make a difference. It will it'll be in an advisory role, and the government don't have to listen. And what I want to know is why people are voting no. And I'm just putting it out there for Aboriginal, other First Nations people that are voting against this. If this referendum doesn't get over the line and we don't get this voice up and running, is that don't think that this wider Australian community is going to support a treaty. Think about it.
Ramon, to you, we've got Sami parliaments in Scandinavia. There are reserved Maori seats in New Zealand, even in some US legislatures like Maine. We've got the Great Council of Chiefs in Fiji. Canada has a Nunavut Parliament of the Inuit people. There are more than a dozen, probably 24 models of advisory bodies for First Nations people. They've got a varying range of responsibilities, most of them a lot wider in range than what's being proposed here. So what's so different and so wrong about the voice by comparison with other Indigenous representation around the world?
I would argue that a lot of these examples are fundamentally divisive. What the voice advocates are fundamentally advocating for is to put an institution into our constitution which some Australians will have access to, but other Australians will not have access to, and the only differentiating factor is their race and ancestry. Now, we all have a voice in Canberra, we all have a voice on the Hill, and that's our House of Representatives and the Senate. We elect our representatives to represent us, and in fact, at the moment, there are, if I'm correct, 11 Indigenous senators and House of Representatives members from across the political spectrum, and I think it's worth noting that Indigenous Australians are not a monolith. They have a variety of views. Some Indigenous people vote Liberal, some vote Labor, some vote Independent, and you can't reduce their views to a single monolith through this voice process. It's not clear how voice members will be elected or selected. It's not clear how representative they will be. I think we should stick to the institutions that work, the institutions that are already in our constitution.
And look, I do want to go to the detail. I can see you wanting to interrupt me there, Kate, but the argument is that if you don't know how the voice will work and the lack of detail, that you shouldn't vote for it. Now, that does seem like common sense to many voters who say that they don't know any Aboriginal people, it doesn't concern them, they're being asked to implement something very serious that they don't understand and has no value for their lives. How do you respond to that concern about the detail?
Look, I understand the concern, but the Constitution isn't a details document. It's really little, tiny little book, and what it says is that it's about powers. So the federal government has the power for defence. It doesn't then go in and say, and this is what the defence forces will look like, and this is where the bases will look like. It just indicates a power to the Commonwealth, and it goes through that way. So the Constitution has no detail about anything. Parliament determines detail on what will happen in defence, where the bases will be, what the breakup will be. Similarly with this. So what the referendum does is it puts in place, recognises Indigenous people as Australia's first people through a voice to Parliament, which will be consultative, and the details on how big it is, how it will work, what the power base will be set by our Parliament. Not by government, but by the whole Parliament, just like every other bit of the Constitution. But there is detail, Genevieve. To say there's none negates the fact that there has been a huge amount of work done on the sort of models that might work. Interestingly, it was Scott Morrison that put in place the Langton Karma review, and what Scott Morrison asked them to look at how the voice would be representative of rural and regional areas. What could it look like? That document exists. In fact, there's a summary of that document on the government website that goes through all the principles that must be in place for the voice document. But at the end of the day, you can't preempt Parliament here because Parliament will determine, and that includes the government, the opposition, the Senate, the whole bit.
And Bill, I mean, there's a point to be made here. Every referendum we've ever had has been 3 or 4 or 5 lines long because the referenda decide principles and values. The Constitution, as Kate says, doesn't provide extensive detail on anything because that's the Parliament's job to work out, and the Parliament is elected by every Australian, 97% enrolment now, which would be a record in Western democracies. The consultation process for this has been going on for 2017. So why do we need more detail than that?
Well, you're not going to buy a house unless you actually go and have a look at it. You're not going to buy a used car or a car of any description unless you take it for a test drive. You're going to really rely too on searches and inquiries from local government authorities before you buy a house, and I think that's what is causing a lot of problem out there in voterland. People need to know more about the voice. There is no detail about it. It's not a case of, trust us, the Parliament's going to work out. The Parliament consists of various parties, a lot of which, and a lot of people aren't terribly enamoured by any of them particularly. And can you really trust Parliament to actually get this right? The Australian Constitution, yes, most of the questions have been fairly short, and most of them, unless there's been unanimous support, have fallen at the wayside. Let's go back to a very contentious issue, the conscription debates, the two votes there on conscription in 1916 and 17. Both of those narrowly went down. I think one of them had a majority of the population, but only 3 states each. They were very hotly contested by both sides. There was a fairly basic, simple question there, and it was argued well, and people understood that, yet it still went down, and probably for very good reason. The troops at the front didn't want it. With the voice, one of the big criticisms is, well, what is it? How many people are going to be in this legislative body? How's it going to work? Why should we actually trust the Parliament? Why is the actual
We trust them with everything else.
Well, yeah, and they don't necessarily do a very good job, Kate. Just wait till electricity starts going off and we get blackouts in a couple of years' time.
But Bill, I might actually go to Aunty Violet on that, because Aunty Violet, there's a point here from the no case, isn't there, that we don't know exactly how this will work out. Yeah. Parliament will make laws on how the voice works. Parliament doesn't have a great reputation for getting it right on First Nations issues. There's all sorts of things from the intervention, from the decision to then repeal the cashless welfare cards and so on and so forth. The voice can't force Parliament to do anything, so why would you trust the Parliament to enact and enable this well?
Well, Parliament has been making decisions on behalf of every Australian that lives in this country, even refugees that come to this country. And I support refugees, and I always say, well, refugees are welcome on Ngunnawal land, but we have to do things differently. We've got to trust. And I don't accept it anymore that no voters, and this is just an excuse, that they don't understand there's not enough information there. Have they looked around? Have they opened their eyes? Parliament has been making decisions on behalf of the First Nations people for years. Like I said, I'm 68-year-old. I've been in Australia as a First Nations people. I remember the 1967 referendum, when 90% of Australians voted to include us in the census. Now we're asking for Australians to support us with this referendum, with this voice to Parliament. For too long we've had people speak on our behalf, and these people are being self-appointed leaders. It's like the Warren Mundines. If this is happening, if it's so bad in Jacinda Price's community, why hasn't she put her hand out and said to a community, how can we fix this?
Ramon,
maybe she has.
I want to go
hasn't.
to you.
Let me tell you, she's not allowed on country.
She's lost 11 relatives.
Hang on. Let's not get hung up on Jacinda Price's family circumstances. Ramon, I'm really interested in your perspective as someone whose parents came here in the 80s. That's a fairly recent migrant experience. What Australian values do you believe are compromised by the voice proposal? I mean, what would be the problem in terms of what your parents, for example, were seeking when they chose Australia to live in?
Yeah, so as you said, my parents came here in the 1980s. I suppose you could say my family is a relatively recent transplant to Australia, much in contrast to anti-violence family who have been here for some 65,000 years. So when my parents came here, Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister, and I think Bob Hawke said it better than any of us ever could. During his Prime Ministership, he spoke at a multicultural community event, and he said that in Australia, there should be no hierarchy of descent. There should be no privilege of origin. The only thing needful to be a true Australian is your commitment to the country. And I think those words ring true today as much as they rang true back then. They certainly ring true with me. Now, what the Voice proposal is trying to establish is a hierarchy of descent. It is trying to privilege people of a certain origin by giving them a constitutional role which other Australians do not have access to. And that's what I think is wrong about it.
Kate, why wouldn't the process for choosing the Voice be subject to all the same problems we already have with people using power and money and influence to get elected? I mean, what's to stop lobbyists from interfering? A Clive Palmer-like figure bankrolling someone, and arguably with the Voice you've got less clarity, less protection against that than we have in the much bigger parliamentary system, and there's a lot at play given resources and development.
Local Indigenous populations, communities, are going to elect their representative. They will determine, when I heard some people say, but they might not even be Indigenous, I promise you the local communities won't vote for someone who's not a very definite part of the local community. They won't vote for people that they don't trust. So the people that will be elected by local communities to represent those communities. So I don't really think that if someone came in and bankrolled a local person to stand, that the local community are going to vote for someone they don't trust, because they are really getting behind this. They are taking responsibility for the Voice working. And again, as Noel Pearson and lots of others say, this is an opportunity for us, might be our last opportunity to make a fundamental difference. And so we are going to get behind making this happen as Indigenous people. They won't wear it if non-Indigenous Australians come in and try to take over the Voice. And why would you? The entity does not have a grants process. They don't run services. They're not like ATSEC used to be. They are a consultative advocacy group who will make representation to government. They have no power, so why would you take them over?
Bill, I just want to tackle the suggestion that the Voice could weigh in on anything. So we've had suggestions, tax reform, banking system, defence. Now, the referendum question does say that the Voice is limited to matters that specifically concern Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It can't mandate any legislation. I mean, frankly, don't you think it'll have enough to do, given the state of life expectancy, health and education outcomes? Why on earth would they be weighing in on, tax law reform?
That begs the question, why do we need another advisory body? The problem is in the Constitution. I think my old friend Julian Lesser even picked this up, but said he was still happy to vote yes to see how it went and give it a go. Pardon me for putting my glasses up. And that's because the Section 129, the proposed section in subparagraph 2, says the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The problem there is the Executive Government. That means the public service, it means the ministers. Maybe if it was just the Parliament, that wouldn't be too much of a problem. But by putting the Executive Government in there and matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is a problem. Virtually everything done in Australia relates to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I think one learned justice commented about, does that means that they might have some say in terms of nuclear submarines or in parking matters? Not sure about the parking matters, but perhaps. But the fact is, anything does relate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and by putting executive government in there, that means that those favouring the no case who worry about constitutional challenges have a very good point. And I think the last thing we need is for the High Court to be bogged down for the next 10 years with a whole lot of constitutional challenges, because there's a few people perhaps who form part of the Voice and part of the committee on The Voice who don't like the executive government's decision and take it to the High Court. And as Albo himself said, it'd be a pretty brave government who didn't take notice of The Voice. It's fraught with difficulties. I don't think it has been seen through very well. And I think what should have happened, as I said earlier, is amend the Constitution for a simple recognition change of our Indigenous brethren, citizens of Australia since 65,000 years, our institutions, and the fact that we are a multicultural society, and that gives recognition, and you can then build on that. But I think there are so many problems with the way this has been worded, and the constitutional wording really just opens it up to all sorts of problems.
Ramon, do you think that most voters on either side of this debate understand how the Constitution works?
Look, I think most voters have pretty good intuition. Not everyone knows the Constitution.
That sounds a lot like the vibe to me, Ramon. It's Marbo, it's the vibe.
It might be the vibe. I think the vibe of this proposal is something that a lot of Australians are very uneasy about, and you can see that borne out in the polls. I think we have a very successful citizens' democracy in Australia, where all people are treated equal, and any proposal that's going to create national assembly bodies for people of a certain race is going to be quite rightly given a great deal of scepticism by voters. Now that doesn't mean they understand the Constitution section by section, but I think we do have pretty good intuition as a nation.
Auntie Violet, can I ask you why we need to do this now? Why not in a more staged way? Why not start maybe with recognition in the Constitution or maybe with treaty negotiations? I mean, why is this the way to fix the problems?
Well, for too long, people have been speaking for us, and our problems have not been fixed. And I'm sorry, but we have not been treated equal in this country. We've always been treated as second-class citizens. And every time we ask for something, First Nations people, we get knocked down. We do not get free cars. We do not get free houses. We do not get free of everything. We work for what we got. First Nations people have their own businesses, but every time we ask for something or support with something, we get knocked down. And I'm also sorry, Bill, as well, is that we have a right to make decisions on behalf of us. So a voice to Parliament, us included in the referendum, is to stop governments making changes on us. We need to speak for ourselves. And we're asking the Australian people to support us with this. We're not asking much, but we have a right to have a voice. And those people that are there, those 11 or 12 Parliament people that have been elected there, Bill, I'm sorry, they just don't speak on behalf of us. They've been elected there by their own community, their own people. So we need for this voice. We need to fix our health problems. We need to fix our housing problems. Over-incarcerated in our prisons, our young people, our women, our men. Our kids are not going through to school. So for us to say that we shouldn't be there makes me so sad, because every time First Nations people ask for something or support, we get knocked down. And Australia's supposed to be a country where we all walk together, we support one another, but we never have ever felt supported by the wider Australians, because we've always been put down.
I'd like to discuss racism allegations on both sides. Kate, some yes voters have suggested that most no voters are just disguised racists. Now that suggests they don't have a right to their opinions. Are the racism allegations from the Yes campaign fair? Are they useful?
I don't think they're useful. There you go. I don't think this is about whether you're a racist or not a racist. I think this is a debate that has to be held in a very appropriate, a very transparent way, and it's not about allegations or finger pointing, and it mustn't be about that. There are people with genuine concerns, and what we're trying to do is get people to ask those questions, things they're worried about. I was at Tamworth at a meeting a couple of days ago, and a woman got up and said, I'm really concerned, I'm a landholder in this area and I've heard this might affect my land tenure. So we explained to her that this was nothing about land rights, what it actually did, that the change to the Constitution set up a consultative body that made representation on behalf of Indigenous communities, that it was nothing to do with land. And she sat down saying, oh, well, I'll vote yes then, because I really, because I think Indigenous people have had a pretty tough time.
Ramon, there is a problem when neo-Nazis turn up at rallies though, isn't there? Because it's true that a few, by no means all, but there are a few no supporters with a very clear track record on racism.
It would be the tiniest minority. So I've been doing local shopping centres, stalls across Canberra for the past few weeks on weekends, advocating for the no case, handing out, having conversations with voters. I haven't had a single conversation with anybody in Canberra that would express what I would call a racist view. Sometimes you get robust conversation, particularly from people that don't agree with me. But I think in large part the community is discussing this issue on its merits, not trying to make this vote about something it's not. This is not a vote about whether we like Indigenous people or dislike Indigenous people. That's not what the referendum is about. The referendum is about inserting a specific section in the Constitution, and that should be debated on its merits. I think I've had a lot of very encouraging conversations with voters out on the hustings about this, and people's genuine concerns about the risk and the permanence of this voice institution, as well as questions about whether the idea of enshrining a race-based National Assembly body in our Constitution really aligns with our core values as a nation. I haven't experienced any racism from either side.
Okay, I'm going to ask you all to sum up with what the impact would be on all Australians the next day, depending on what the result of the referendum is. Bill, say that the yes vote gets up. What effect will that have on your everyday life on the 16th of October onwards?
I probably don't have a huge idea there, but I think at the best it will just add another layer of bureaucracy. It will divide the country because, let's face it, if the yes vote gets up, it's not going to get up by much. It is a divisive issue. I have seen over the last 50 years not much racism in Australia. I have I only got one goddaughter and she's Aboriginal. I haven't seen much racism in Australia, and that's just not in a place like Canberra, but that's right throughout the country. I have seen a genuine goodwill to ensuring that the rights and the lives of Indigenous Australians are improved, and it's still not the case in the Northern Territory. I am a little bit disappointed with Naarty Violet saying Jacinta Price isn't allowed back on her own country. I'll have to have a chat to her about that later and see what that means. But again, I suppose that's indicative of this voice becoming divisive, and I think that's a real problem. If it goes down, well, at least we won't have to worry about the dangers of what can go wrong with it. But whatever happens at the end of the day, on Sunday the 15th of October, let's use this as an opportunity to come together, to listen to our Indigenous brothers and sisters, to move forward as a nation. I see education being a key, and it appalls me that 3 boarding schools for Indigenous kids aren't going to go ahead in the Northern Territory, because with my daughter Lucy, it worked very well when she was at Scholasticus, and they had a whole lot of Indigenous girls from outback New South Wales coming there. Those girls have now gone back to their own communities as nurses, as teachers. Some have stayed in the city and done exceptionally well. That's a program that works. I'd like to see us move forward as a country, do whatever we need to do as a nation to improve the lot and narrow the gap, but move forward in a united way. And I think that's going to be difficult if the voice does get up, because fundamentally it is flawed, because it does inherently divide the nation and put that permanently in the Constitution. And to me, that's just not the right way to go.
Kate, how would you be affected by a no vote? What happens for you if this doesn't get up?
Well, the problem with a no vote is it just means more of the same. What will happen is we'll keep doing what we're doing at the moment with regard to Indigenous people. We'll continue to have the problems we've got with the closing the 19 rules clauses in the closing the gap approach, and I think that would be incredibly sad. I also think it'd be incredibly sad for the very large number of Indigenous people who have worked for so long, for 20 plus years, to get this recognition up through a voice to Parliament. The 250 Indigenous leaders that signed the Uluru Statement of the Heart, I think they will be just so gutted that the rest of Australia said no to them being recognised and having a voice that is the basis of that recognition. So for me, I just can't imagine Australia isn't in the business of giving Indigenous Australians hope and really giving them a fair go, because we haven't until now.
Ramon, what would change in the way that the country functions if there's a yes vote?
I think there's no disputing the symbolic importance of the vote, and I think if a yes vote does get returned, the symbolism of that would be very powerful for Indigenous Australians. I think the real deleterious effects of a yes vote don't come the day after, but they come 100 or 200 years after, when we've closed the gap, when we've assessed we've redressed the material differences between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, and we have a much more free and equal society, and yet we still have this stain of racial division on our constitution that's permanent, that we can't get rid of. That's the real problem with a yes result, not the day after, but 100, 200 years after.
Auntie Violet, to you, last word. How will this be for you if no wins?
I'll be sad, and I will have concerns for our next generations that's growing up, my great-grannies and my grandchildren, is that, and like I always say when I talk about the yes vote, is that I've lived under the Aboriginal Protection Board, and I do not want to see my grannies go through it. And sorry, Bill, there is a lot of racism still in Australia. It's that you've got the wrong coloured skin. And I will be sad, very sad, and my grannies went to Celeste Gitters, 2 of them. I'll be very sad if this doesn't get over, the yes vote doesn't get up, and because this is the one chance we have as Australians to walk together into the future, make a difference. Let us decide, let us make decisions on behalf of us, because for too long people have been talking for us. And this is why this gap is never going to close. And I'm asking the wider Australian community, and particularly the undecided voters, and particularly our young people, we need you to support us with this. Vote yes. And let us have a voice. Let us make a difference so we can walk together as one, as proud Australians. And I'll be very sad, I tell you, because we've put so much into this. So on the 14th of October, vote yes and support us with us. Walk beside us for a better Australia. Thank you.
So we've had a robust conversation. That's what we wanted. We've had an informative, impassioned and well-informed debate. I want to thank our 4 speakers, Auntie Violet Sheridan, Bill Stefaniak, Kate Cardell and Ramon Bucart. And whatever you do when you're casting your vote, find out, inform yourselves, make a decision that is informed and thoughtful and has got some real detail behind it. I'm Genevieve Jacobs. This is Region Media. Thank you.